Chapter 6 Blackberries. "What was the diabolical thing that happened to Mr. Cadaver?" Gramps asked. "You didn't tell us that yet." I explained that just as Phoebe was going to divulge the purely awful thing that happened to Mr. Cadaver, her father came home from work and we all sat down to dinner. Me, Phoebe, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom, and Phoebe's sister, Prudence. Phoebe's parents reminded me a lot of my other grandparents, the Pickfords. Like the Pickfords, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom spoke quietly, in short sentences, and sat straight up as they ate their food. They were extremely polite to each other, saying, "Yes, Norma," and "Yes, George," and "Would you please pass the potatoes, Phoebe?" and "Wouldn't your guest like another helping?" They were picky about their food, too. Everything they ate was what my father would call side dishes. Potatoes, courgettes, bean salad, and a mystery casserole that I could not identify. They didn't eat meat. They didn't use butter. They were very much concerned with cholesterol. From what I could gather, Mr. Winterbottom worked in an office creating road maps. Mrs. Winterbottom baked and cleaned and did laundry and did grocery shopping. I had a funny feeling that Mrs. Winterbottom did not actually like all this baking and cleaning and laundry and shopping. And I'm not quite sure why I had that feeling, because if you just listen to the words she said, it sounded as if she was Mrs. Supreme Housewife. For example, at one point Mrs. Winterbottom said, "I believe I've made more pies in the past week than I can count." She said this in a cheery voice, but afterwards, in a small silence, when no one commented on all those pies she had been busy making, she gave a soft sigh and looked down at her plate. A little later, she said, "I couldn't find exactly that brand of muesli you like so much, George, but I bought something similar." "Oh?" Mr. Winterbottom said. "I'm sure it's quite similar to what you wanted." Mr. Winterbottom kept eating again, and again in that silence, Mrs. Winterbottom gave a soft sigh and examined her plate. I was sort of happy for her when she announced that since Phoebe and Prudence were back in school, she thought she would return to work. Apparently, during the school terms, she worked part-time at Rocky's Rubber as a receptionist. I thought this might be a nice change for her, to be out of the house. But when she mentioned going back to work and no one said anything about it, she sighed again and pushed her potatoes to one side of her plate. A few times, Mrs. Winterbottom called her husband Sweetie Pie and Honey Bun. She said, "Would you like more courgettes, Sweetie Pie?" and "Did I make enough potatoes, Honey Bun?" For some reason, that surprised me, those little names she used. She was dressed in a plain brown skirt and white blouse. On her feet were sensible, wide, flat shoes. She did not wear makeup. Even though she had a pleasant, round face and long yellow curls, the main impression I got was that she was used to being plain and ordinary, that she was not supposed to do anything too shocking. Another odd impression I got was that Mr. Winterbottom was playing the role of father with a capital F. He sat at the head of the table with his white shirt cuffs rolled back neatly. He still wore his red and blue striped tie. He kept his face very serious throughout the entire meal. His voice was deep and his words were clear. "Yes, Norma," he said deeply and clearly. "No, Norma." He looked more like 52 than 38, but this was not something I would ever call to his or Phoebe's attention. Phoebe's sister Prudence was quite a bit like her mother. Prudence was 17 years old, but she acted like she was almost a mother herself. She ate primly. She nodded politely. She smiled a small, polite smile after everything she said. It all seemed peculiar. They acted so thumpingly tidy and respectable. At the end of dinner, Mr. Winterbottom brought in the blackberry pie. I ate it, even though the blackberries did not have as much flavor as they did back in Bybanks, Kentucky. Mr. Winterbottom asked Phoebe who was in her class at school. She started naming everyone, and when she got to Mary Lou Finney, Mr. Winterbottom said, "Finney? Finney?" He turned to Mrs. Winterbottom. "Norma, is Mr. Finney the one who wears blue jeans? The one who's always throwing that football?" "Yes, George." To Phoebe, he said, Is Mary Lou the one who goes around saying omnipotent? Phoebe said yes. Mr. Winterbottom said, I suppose they probably appear a bit odd. Mr. Winterbottom said, Norma, I wouldn't want to judge, but he was judging. I could tell. He didn't like the Finneys, or maybe he was jealous of them. Mrs. Winterbottom gave her a soft sigh and folded her napkin. I had the feeling that there was something she really wanted to say, but she had already decided that no one would listen. After dinner, Phoebe walked me home, and on the way, she talked about Mrs. Cadaver. She said, you wouldn't think it to look at her, but Mrs. Cadaver is as strong as an ox. How do you know that? I said. Phoebe looked behind her, as if she was expecting someone to be following us. Because, she said, I have seen her chop down trees and lug the remains clear across the backyard. Do you know what I think? I think maybe she killed Mr. Cadaver and chopped him up and buried him in the backyard. Phoebe, I said. Well, I'm just telling you what I think. That's all. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Mrs. Cadaver, and I wanted to believe that she was capable of killing her husband and chopping him into pieces and burying him in the backyard. And then I started thinking about the blackberries and about how spoiled I was by blackberries in Bybanks, Kentucky. I had a vision of my mother and me walking around the rims of the fields and pastures, picking blackberries in the summer, just as we used to. We filled our pockets with blackberries. We did not pick from the bottom of the vine or from the top. The ones at the bottom were for the rabbits, my mother said, and the ones at the top were for the birds. The ones at people height were for people. Lying in bed, remembering those blackberries, made me think of something else too. It was something that happened a couple years ago, on a morning when my mother slept late. It was that time she was pregnant. My father and I had already eaten breakfast, and he was out in the fields. On the table, my father and I had left a single flower in each of the two juice glasses. A black-eyed Susan in front of my place, and a white petunia in front of my mother's. My father must have gone out into the field and picked them as soon as he had awakened. When my mother came into the kitchen that day, she saw the flowers immediately. Oh, she said, glory! She bent her face toward each flower. She looked out the window and said, let's go find him. We climbed the hill to the barn, crawled between the fence wires, and crossed the field. My father was standing at the far end of the field, his back to us, hands on his hips, looking at a section of fence. My mother slowed down when she saw him. I was right behind her. It looked as if she wanted to creep up and surprise him. So I was quiet too, and cautious in my steps. I could hardly keep from giggling. It seemed so daring to be sneaking up on my father, and I was sure my mother was going to throw her arms around him and kiss him and hug him and tell him how much she loved him. The flower on the kitchen table. My mother has always loved anything that normally grows or lives out of doors. Anything. Lizards, trees, cows, caterpillars, birds, flowers, grasshoppers, crickets, toads, dandelions, ants, and pigs. Just before we reached my father, he turned around. Maybe he heard us. This seemed to surprise my mother and throw her off her guard. She stopped. Sugar, he said. My mother opened her mouth, and I was thinking, come on, throw your arms around him, tell him. But before she could speak, my father pointed to the fence and said, look at that, a morning's work. He indicated a new length of wire strung between two new posts. There was sweat on his face and arms. And then I saw that my mother was crying. My father saw it too. What? He said. He stepped toward her, and she said, oh, you're too good, John. You're too good. All you Hiddles are too good. I'll never be so good. I'll never be able to think of all the things I can never do like you do. My father looked down at me. The flowers, I said. Oh, he said. He put his sweaty arms around her, but she was still crying, and it wasn't what I had imagined it would be. It was all sad instead of happy. The next morning, when I went into the kitchen, my father was standing beside the table. He was looking at two small dishes of blackberries, still shiny and wet with dew. One dish at his place and one at mine. Thank you, I said. No, it wasn't me, he said. It was your mother. Just then she came in from the back porch. My father put his arms around her and they smooched, and it was all tremendously romantic. And I started to turn away, but my mother caught my arm. She pulled me into her and said to me, though it was meant to be for my father, I think, "See, I'm almost as good as your father." She said it in a shy way, laughing a little. I felt betrayed, but I didn't know why. After that dinner, After that dinner at Phoebe's, where we had the blackberry pie, I started wondering about all of this. I had been a part of my mother. She was me, and I was her, more than I was a part of my father. So anything that was true of her was true of me. It wasn't as if she had said, "We're almost as good as your father," and I wanted to say, we're better. But why I wanted to say this, I don't know. I love my father. It is surprising all of the things you remember just by eating blackberry pie.